their grandparents, and even their great-grandparents. Ask the same question, they're all going to give you the same answer. No. What we saw here 4 years ago is going to be what we tell our grandchildren about. Let me help you understand how big this eruption was by comparing it to others. Because when I first moved here in 2013, all everybody could tell me about was like, hey, brah, you should have been here for the eruption of 1990. It was so historical. And my response to that was usually like, hey, brah, like, I was born in 1990. So even if I was here, I would have just been a baby. So I wouldn't have seen anything. But like, I understand where they're coming from. That was a very historical time period. That was the time period in which the eruption of Pupu'o'o, at 7 years into the eruption, had a breakout and started sending lava towards one of the top 5 biggest towns on the island. And so the town I'm speaking of is called Kalapana. And so every day the lava would ooze its way closer to the town. And remember, lava's not going to be raging around here. It's oozing. It's not going super duper fast. And so that's why you don't hear about a bunch of people dying from these lava flows. Now, in regards to how these eruptions work, you're really curious about how fast an eruption is. You're trying to wonder if you can outrun one. If you saw one in the park or something, you're like, I gotta run from this. Okay, you'd run for your life for about a minute. You're probably good for the whole day. Because the average speed of an eruption is about 30 yards per day. So if you cover less than a third of a North American football field in the span of a day, you're probably gonna make it. And so, of course, there's going to be exceptions to that. Nonetheless, though, the town of Kalapana, little by little, was getting buried by lava. So nowadays, you can't hike to a lava flow. Like, that's been 4 years ago. The only people who want to hike to a lava flow fly to Iceland. They have an incredible lava flow happening. And so, I would be still willing to say that out of the last 32 years, there was at least 20 years where people had a moment where they could hike to a lava flow. And so, out of those 20 years, I'm willing to say that about half of those folks, about a third of those folks easily had to take a hike that required them to walk on Kalapana. And half of them probably didn't even realize it. See, to them, they just thought they were walking on smooth Puhoe lava. But they didn't understand that beneath their feet were houses and restaurants and schools, playgrounds, and the world's most famous black sand beach. Because right next to Kalapana was Kaimu black sands. So imagine the beach we saw today. This one was over 3 miles of jet black sand, hundreds of coconut trees everywhere. Yeah, I've only seen Kaimu black sands beach from postcards. Because the year I was born was the year that beach was destroyed. So I've seen that. I have to in the postcards I usually see involve an eruption destroying that beach. And so when it comes to that area, so much lava has buried Kalapana since that those folks that used to have to hike down to see the eruption when they were walking on Kalapana, if you wanted to get down to the former town, you had to drill down more than 80 feet to get to where it previously stood. And now, that also kept destroying this other road. There was this magical road that some people talked about in the past that predated my time here. They're like, oh, Dreu, there was because I told people all the time, you would never pave a road to an eruption. That'd be very foolish. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars. And so, but yes, in the 1980s and the 1990s and the early 2000s, people would mention this road where you might see the eruption, you might be able to hike to the eruption. Sometimes it's just the lava crossing the road and into the ocean. That road they're speaking on is called Highway 132. And that was just a regular commuter road. We didn't pave a road so people could see an eruption. And so every time we tried to fix the road, it got destroyed by another one. And so after 2016, we gave up on that road. But it was just looked at as a junk road. And then every time they would always be under construction, always be getting hit by a lava flow at some point. And so really the only good road for the residents of Lower Puna was Highway 130. And it wasn't a big deal, only having one good road, until it became a big deal. And it became a big deal decades later after 1990. It wasn't until June 27th, 2014 that another major moment was occurring. And I was definitely here for that one. When little by little, the cinder cone Pupu'o'o started pushing lava towards one of the top 5 biggest towns on the island. It's like, that's deja vu. Except this time the town I'm speaking of is called Pahoa. Every day you turn on the radios and civil defense would update the public with how close the eruption was getting. And you'd be like, oh, today the eruption traveled 45 yards. It's now within 3 miles of the Koa village homesteads. And so you would be able to turn on the Gully Homestead subdivisions. You can watch YouTube footage of people like at the time with garden hoses watering the lava as it was oozing its way towards their houses. Some of them have houses as a result of their actions. And so a couple weeks later, you turn on the radios and you're like, oh, today it's the eruption traveled 15 yards. It's now within 2 miles of the Pahoa shopping centers. And so that was when it was getting a little more uncomfortable, because you see all the restaurants and the shops all closing down, and they weren't like just getting checks, and they were just not working. And all the schools, all the notes that were being written on the walls, like they were basically kissing the town goodbye. So all the keiki, they're having to relive this before Zoom meetings and stuff, so they just had to crowd up other school districts. You go to bed at nighttime and you look out your window and the whole skies are red. You'd have all your most important stuff packed up, ready to take off at a moment's notice. You go to school in one of the farther districts and you're catching a bus back and you're thinking, I wonder if today's the day. I wonder if there's even going to be a home to go back to. Some people, they wonder when they've traveled this island, they're like, where are these places that were impacted by eruptions? Where is this Kalapana? Where is this Pahoa? How do you get to the Leilani Estates? To this green sign right here. It says if you turn right, 11 miles to Pahoa, 22 miles to Kalapana. What it doesn't say is 14 miles to Leilani. Those are the three major scenarios that have happened in the last 32 years. Right now, I'm telling you about the second scenario. When in 2014, that lava was getting closer and closer to the town. It got real to a lot of us. Whenever civil defense would turn on the radios and they said, today the eruption has now traveled 70 yards in the last 24 hours. It's now within half a mile of Highway 130. So there's a problem, because if the lava crosses 130, we're talking about thousands of residents being what you call lava locked, which means there would have been no escape until the eruption would have come to an end. See all these cars? I've been seeing dozens of cars turning right now in the distance. That traffic light, that's Highway 130. And so that's the road that leads down to the cheapest land in all of Hawaii. And so I know people have to drive for hours just to go work 9 to 5s that live down in those areas. And so I'll put it to you like this. Some people, nobody has to feel sorry for me for driving an hour to go to work, because a lot of folks have to drive way farther distances on this island. Because usually how it works is that one person in your household works extra hard so that everybody else they care about can enjoy a really good quality life in Hawaii. All those cars you see turning, and this is late at night. Imagine if you're here at 5 o'clock in the evening, so they know exactly what I'm talking about, the folks that live down in that direction. And so when I first moved here in 2013, first job I scored was Wendy's. We used to have a Wendy's back then. You can tell the glory days. But when the second job I had, I scored a couple months in, was working at the King Kamehameha Hotel, which is based in Kailua. It's like a mile north of where you guys are staying out of the window. And I got to be a bellman by the time I quit that job. Second longest job I ever had. I worked there 3.5 years. When I first started there, though, the job they hired me on was a janitor. And so I remember being the janitor, cleaning the library in 2014, and seeing the news reports popping up on the TV screens, like big old CNN-like headlines, saying, today, update, emergency update, the lava has now traveled 500 yards in 24 hours. It is now within a quarter mile of the Pahoa fire station. And so at that point, we're just like, that's it, game over for the town. A few more days and the lava giving us all big question marks in our head. The eruption came to an end. And by the time it was all said and done, what was destroyed was the cemetery, was part of the transfer station where you throw away the recyclables and the rubbish. It flowed on the second busiest street in town, Pa'a Street. It destroyed one person's house, one person's shed, and 4 utility poles. And that was it. The town of Pahoa is spared. It was looked upon as a miracle, because they didn't dodge a bullet. They survived an eruption. So state officials, though, they realize 130 is not going to be good enough. So enter the concept of developing Highway 137. And that road was not met with open arms. A lot of folks were protesting the construction. They're like, you can't build over there. That's going to be Hawaiian burial sites that you're building that on. It's going to wind up being one cursed road. Well, they built it and opened it up to the public in summertime of 2017, and in less than a year from that time period, it was being destroyed by the eruption. And so we think back to April of 2018, the last month we had both of those eruptions, the 35-year and the 10-year eruption. That was the last time we could hike out to a lava flow. And nobody said that was easy. That was 8.5 miles round trip. It was a very harsh, uneven, and very dangerous volcanic terrain. Matter of fact, the tour guide died trying to hike his guests out to the eruption then. And so during that time period, that's when the National Park Service, they deemed the trail of inaccessible. They said it was too unpredictable. Meanwhile, the summit started pushing out the most lava that we'd seen in over 90 years, starting to spill into the other craters. So whenever that was going down, it was April 30th. I remember that was the last day that a helicopter tried to fly out to the cinder cone with the expectation of showing them the eruption. Because let's face it, that's what helicopter companies were doing here for 35 years. That was the final day. Because that was the day that it was also the first day. The first of many to come from major earthquakes. The ones that are above 5 on the Richter scale. We had 50 of those. The first one that occurred with the epicenter was and just like that, half the cinder cone exploded into a cloud of pink ash. You could have saw this explosion from Saddle Road like I did when I was driving through. And so that helicopter, it survived the explosion, but you better believe it got the heck on out of there. It's supposed to try to stick around and see what else could happen. That hadn't happened before in 35 years. Meanwhile, the summit started rapidly receding. It was as if somebody had pulled the plug on the bathtub drain. And so we thought we'd never see lava up there again. Because, let's face it, there was an 80-year pause between eruptions at the summit. Who would have thought what we saw tonight is the second eruption that's happened up there since. It's just a reminder of how nothing is predictable for Kilauea. And so I just remember that all this lava was all two major sources in 2018. Ones that lasted for years, decades. They're disappearing at exactly the same time. That's a bunch of red flags. Where in the world is the lava going? And so sometimes we get lucky, and we actually get a heads up about these eruptions. Like the current eruption was an example. We had weeks to prepare for it. I think back to that 2014 scenario with Pahoa. They had months to prepare for the potential destruction of their town. But what happened here in 2018, some folks had, months. Some folks had weeks. Some folks had 30 hours. From the moment things started getting weird to the moment they were being greeted by the eruption itself. See, I remember that on May 1st, we were all wondering where all the lava went, and we were all just trying to get a good night's sleep that evening when the whole island just started shaking, especially if you lived on this part. And so what we all do is just turn on the radios. What's Civil Defense got to say about this? And they gave out the most cryptic message I've ever heard them deliver. Because they didn't know what to tell people. They were like, listen guys, we can't guarantee an eruption's going to happen. But if you live in Nanawale, if you live in Kapo'o, if you live in Leilani Estates, I want to start getting your stuff together now. So you may not get the chance to properly evacuate. And so I just remember that I remember calling up one of my buddies that lives over there. I was like, hey, Kalau was shaking. Heard you getting a lot of press over there. And he was like, I tell you, it feels like there's one 400-pound Samoa man just pressing on my living room grounds last 24 hours. Non-stop shaking. And by the way, you guys can clearly tell you're driving past the biggest city on the island, so Hilo, just getting a tiny little glimpse of Hilo as I'm just trying to get some of the back roads in to get over to Saddle. I hope you do spend some real time in this city. There is a lot of interesting things about this town. I'm just in another zone right now. And so I was just letting you know that May 1st, all the earthquakes happening. May 2nd, that's when I called my buddy up. And May 3rd, I remember I was trying to snorkel that day when my buddy, one of my best friends, ended up driving over here, Zane Smith. I mentioned him as being the owner of Hawaii Geo Tours. And this is an island because everybody knows everybody. My friends know who he is. They're like, Zane, what you doing all the way over here? And he's like, well, with all these earthquakes, eruption's about to happen. And they're like, oh, dang, another eruption. Where's it going to be? And he was like, right here. And sure enough, just a few hours later, that's with all these earthquakes, that's when the cracks started appearing all over these areas. A few hours after that, that's when the steam starts coming out of all these cracks. And a few hours later, that's when the lava is starting to free itself up from all these cracks. And so that's what made this eruption different, from the second it began. Because the other scenarios I've been telling you about, the lava was oozing towards the towns. But this one, the lava was coming from the town. It was coming from the streets. It was coming from the backyards. There was fissures that were opening up. These are called fissures, where the ground opens up and lava frees itself from it. Where they were wider than that highway we were just on, fissures opening up. Houses were just swallowed whole by the size of these fissures, only for fountains of lava to shoot up. In some instances, I guess we could say 4 if you want to be exact, more than 200 feet into the sky. So these are, when it came to these fissures, we had over 20 different fissures opening up during this eruption. I only saw a small one, Fissure 12. We had the granddaddy of them all was called Fissure 8, which, by the way, has its own Hawaiian name, and that's Ahu Ailau, which is the name of a Hawaiian deity that would come around once every few hundred years and would have this insatiable appetite for the forest of Puna. They say that the lava tube you walked into earlier was the last time Ailau came out 500 years ago. And so Fissure 8, or Ailau, whatever you want to think of it as, at one point during its peak was pushing out more than 27,000 gallons of lava per second. And so you think about all these fissures opening up, they start trying to lava. The same rule applies. It's traveling in the areas that give it the least resistance. And so at one point it created a river of lava, the likes of which we've never seen before on this island. Because, okay, I'm going to say like this. The fastest I ever saw was in that 2014 scenario when I was a janitor, and I said it went 500 yards in a day, which is way faster than 30 yards a day on average. That's comparable to what happened to this city, which, by the way, there's a beautiful city. Hilo's awesome. It's just, the rainiest city in the United States. It's also the most volcanically sensitive city in the United States, and it's also the tsunami capital of the world. So where do you sign up? But other than that, when it comes to Hilo, last time I was threatened by an eruption, that's not ancient history. That was only 1984. I had a friend of mine that's got the day-by-day newspapers of March of 84, because every day it was like, is it going to destroy Hilo? It's coming faster, it's speeding up. Because at one point it was going at speeds more than 1 kilometer per day. So by the time that eruption stopped, it was only 4 miles away from Hilo. 4 miles away from destroying the biggest city on the island. You really want to know how close that eruption got to this town? Great. Why don't you Google image search the 1984 city lights of Hilo? And what's going to come up is some old Journey song. It'll be a picture of Hilo, taken at nighttime, with this eerie red river heading straight for the town. And so, of course, then we want to talk about the eruptions that are legendary. Well, you saw, we drove through 2 of them. One of them I acknowledged and the other one I didn't. The one I brought up was the one called Ho'okenamalka, the old town that was destroyed in 1949, overnight by an eruption. And so that was because that eruption was traveling at speeds of more than 1 mile per hour. But the one that every eruption was compared to was almost 100 years ago, the eruption that destroyed the town of Miali'i, which is looked upon as the last great fishing village of the world. See, that eruption ended up traveling more than 13 miles in less than 3 hours. And the only reason why everybody didn't die in Miali'i is because it's a fishing village. They all got on their boats and escaped the town. And so that's what every eruption was compared to. We didn't think an eruption would ever go faster than 4 miles an hour. Well, the 2018 eruption proved that that could certainly be a possibility. Because by the time that eruption was in its peak, it had created a river of lava that was more than half a mile wide and more than 11 miles long, dumping into the ocean at one point with speeds exceeding 22 miles an hour. When it was dumping into the ocean, at one point the air quality was easily 40 times worse than the air of today, or 200 times worse than no eruption at all. And so as destructive as this eruption was, you got to think it's also responsible for creation. We wouldn't have any of these islands if it wasn't for these eruptions. And yeah, it definitely caused some destruction because, I'll put it like this. We think about the 35-year eruption of Pu'uho'o that destroyed 214 homes in 35 years. In 4.5 months, the 2018 eruption destroyed almost 1,000 homes, displaced thousands of residents, and damaged hundreds of homes, and destroyed a lot of beautiful areas that I can only look back on via memory cards or just using my actual memory itself. Here today, gone tomorrow. And so, remember, tomorrow we can have new land because of this kind of stuff. Because all the other islands, they're so much older that they're sinking back into the ocean. The Big Island is the only one that's still growing. And when people want to question that, great. Look no further than the 2018 eruption. So by the time that eruption was all said and done, the Big Island got more than 875 acres larger. That land is here to stay. There are roads being built on that land. There's squatters over there building tiny homes in that land. And pretty soon, at some point in most of your lives, you're going to see for sale signs over there. That's just how things work. You're talking about how life is in Hawaii. Now you're familiar with the 2018 eruption. Now I'm going to go ahead and focus on a few